everybody, it's Editing Vivian. I'm just popping in at the beginning of the episode to tell you that I am aware that we have been having some audio problems on the last several episodes, particularly in regards to Ollie's microphone. Unfortunately, this was a problem that I didn't catch until we had already recorded quite a few episodes. Basically could either re-record and lose everything or just keep it as is. I didn't think it was bad enough to warrant getting rid of the episodes entirely. However, I am aware that it is not ideal listening material. This episode still does have the problem, but it should be the last of the episodes that have this problem. I have spot checked the next several that we recorded in order to make sure, and it has been recorded properly from what I can tell, though I haven't edited them yet, but they should be fine. I'm really sorry about that. We've been having some technical problems. Both Ollie and I have gotten new computers since some of the hiccups, and also kind of changed several settings and fixed things around, and hopefully this will not be a problem again in the future. So sorry again, and I hope you enjoy this episode, and at least enjoy the fact that this is the last of these kinds of episodes. Bye!
Hello! I didn't know what that was. I was excited. Welcome to I'm a Fan of That. We're back. We're here. Season 3 is going well. Mostly, we think. I'm enjoying it. I hope you guys are enjoying it. And we have a fun topic, an object, if you will, this week. Well, it's kind of many objects, as both of us went, oh no, we have too much of both of
We
this
have
thing.
a lot of options.
Yeah, we just couldn't pick anything. Which I think may give you a clue, because we're talking about genre, and particularly crossing genre in fiction, where you go to the big pick and mix thing in the genre, W.H. Smith's or Woolworth's if you're old, and you pick out your genres and you mix them all together in a cup, and some child probably touched them. I don't know. It's a long metaphor. So we could have picked any book from my Pratchett collection. You've got Dresden.
I've got Dresden right behind me, and then above that is Stuart Turton, who is also lovely in this.
Is there Rivers of London there as well?
Yes, up above somewhere here is Rivers of London.
I've got Andrew Joseph White's books down here, which are horror fantasy, various different things. They are also very queer. I don't know if queerness is a genre, but booksellers seem to think it is.
Yeah, why not?
There's so many things I could pick out. I think it's very rare now that I buy books that are one thing. We've even got terminology for it, right? We've got like romantasy as one word, that kind of stuff.
I did have a recent experience of picking up a very straight only fantasy. And
what was that like?
I didn't get past the 20th page.
Because this is about the point where I say something a bit controversial, where I don't even think that Tolkien is strictly straight fantasy, because I think it's historical fantasy, or it falls much more in, like, I think at the time it would have just been fantasy, but I think now when you look at it in the canon of things, it feels like a historical writing.
I mean, I guess novel. I just feel bad saying an author that I don't like, because he seems like an all right guy, but it was Brandon Sanderson. Yeah. I have read a Brandon Sanderson that I very, very love, but I think the narration did a lot of heavy lifting in that I have since really, really struggled to find. So, oh well, I guess it's just not for me.
Mm-hmm. Like, I think there are very, very few. Like, so I'm reading the C.J. Sampson books at the moment, which are historical fiction, but they're detective fiction. They're great.
Mine's downstairs. I just finished reading the first one.
Oh, they're brilliant. They're so fun. Matthew Shardlake is a wonderful character, and if these books, I've said this to you before, but if these books were written now, people would call them woke nonsense. Because apparently having a disabled main character and a man of colour running around solving crimes together must be woke nonsense. But they were written in the early 2000s, so they're fine. They're not getting that label thrown at them. They're really good. They're really, really good.
They are very frequently found in charity shops, so I'm just grabbing them when I see them.
They're one of those sorts of series. We could go on about C.J. Sampson forever, but I think they're one of those things that, because they're so popular, they're always going to pop up.
Yeah.
everywhere because people will be clearing out books or whatever.
But yes, that's like a history/mystery series.
History mystery.
Stuart Turton is one of my favorite authors, current writing authors, I should probably specify, because I've got a lot of favorite authors.
Yes.
But he does, I think everything is always some mystery mixed with just insert extra genre here. So his first one was The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, which was a very sci-fi mix. It was where the detective is waking up in a different body in a day that is playing over and over and over again. So it's like Groundhog Day sci-fi meets a mystery. It's
a
so
bit
good.
Sort of Quantum Leap, isn't it?
Yeah, his second one was a ghost ship, so it was like a horror ghost story. Right up my street.
I'm gonna put
you
them
should.
on my
list. I have them. Oh, they're all right here. The third one, which just recently came out, was a dystopian sci-fi mixed with a mystery. So there's always a mystery element, which is my thing, and then he always mixes it with something which makes it super fun and fascinating.
Because the other thing I'm reading at the moment is the Murderbot Diaries, which while
lots
I
of
would
murder.
Say, Murderbot. But the thing is, the Murderbot Diaries they're hard sci-fi in many ways, but they're comedy books. They're very, very funny. And very, very tongue-in-cheek kind of look at science fiction, and so I would call them like a sci-fi comedy. It's sort of in the same way that things like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and stuff is, except the sci-fi I would say is harder and less, it's the narration, again, like the Brandon Sanderson was saying, it was the narration that does the heavy lifting of this is funny. And the Apple TV series has just come out, which has, I think, lent more into the comedy elements of it because of the visual component, whereas with the books, because you're just inside Murderbot's head, you only get, and Murderbot uses its pronouns, just for people who don't know that, but you only get its perspective on what's going on, and it's very sarcastic and funny, and it deals with trauma with humor, which makes them an entertaining narrator, but also a deeply unreliable narrator. So you have no idea what's actually happening, which obviously the TV show has kind of lent into. But they're very funny books. So I think that's the thing, is that I think people think genre crossover, and they think that means like, a detective sci-fi, and that's the two genres. But when you have comedy, like rom-coms, for example, the main plot is still the romance, but the comedy element sort of sits on top of it to mess with that a little bit. And you have a very specific thing.
Because our item was, we just kind of looked behind us and went, oh yes, we could grab any of these. Obviously books were kind of foremost what we led with, but obviously movies, TV shows are doing a lot of these same things as well. And I recently watched, I said recently, it's been a couple of weeks, and by the time this comes out it'll be even more, but I watched Shape of Water. I'm a bit late coming to it.
Amazing.
But it's been on my list for a really long time, and I just didn't really know much about it, and I finally got around to watching it, and it is amazing. And that, I think, is a masterclass in how a movie can mix genres in just the most beautifully wonderful way.
Yeah. And I know that there is a sort of flippant way of talking about it as a monster fucker movie. It's not.
Yes.
Monster fucker is a very specific thing. Whereas it's a monster romance movie. It's a romance. We're not just here to fuck the monster guy.
When I went to go watch it, the only thing I knew about it was the jokes about it being this, like, monster fucker movie. At a certain point, like, because it's very quickly that she's like, I'm into this guy.
Yeah, wouldn't we all, though?
So when she was, like, already all in, Tom, because I was watching it with Tom, and Tom just goes, I didn't think... I thought it was an exaggeration when people were going in about how much she wanted to fuck a fish, but I guess she really does.
I mean, I've read a lot of Hellboy fan fiction in my time, and people want Abe so bad. This movie is the people who want Abe movie. Like, that's it, right? I mean, I think Guillermo del Toro wants Abe Sapien by the looks of this movie.
But I think
he made 2 Hellboy movies as well.
Taking the kind of silliness out of it, I think one of the things that's really wonderful about the movie was that it was so strange to be like, no, I'm going to take a monster movie and I'm going to mix it with a romance
and take it seriously as well. Like,
yes, it's very honest and earnest in it, and I think if it wasn't, it wouldn't land in the way that it did. And
I think it's an absolutely beautiful movie, and I mean, what it's actually talking about is the monster is a metaphor. We always know that.
Yes.
That's kind of thing for the other. And obviously our lead character as well, our romance love interest as she is, because of course it's a romance movie, and so it should be female led. That's one of the core tenets of romance, is that the woman is the main character, and she's also disabled. But she is disabled, and the monster character is sort of disabled by their environment. Othered, yeah. Definitely, yeah. And they don't speak the same language or any of these things. And it's a very beautiful take on those sorts of stories. Because I think a lot of people compare it to things like Beauty and the Beast, except the Beast, the monster character does not turn into a human at the end. She turns into a fish. Spoilers.
Spoiler.
Sorry. Do go watch it. It's wonderful.
It's a beautiful movie. And I think that one of the really interesting takes on it, because it takes place in like height of Cold War times,
as all Guillermo del Toro movies do.
He loves really dealing with fascism, doesn't he?
Yeah.
But yeah, so one of the really wonderful things about it is that if that movie had been made more pure monster movie, it would have the kind of main antagonist, the really evil, he's like a government CIA guy. He would he would have been the protagonist. He would have been the hero of the story.
And he'd have got the girl,
and he wants the girl, and he's also fighting this monster, and if it was told from his point of view, it would be so different, but it's not. It's told from the point of view of marginalized people, and it's not just the main character who's marginalized. It's her neighbor, who's a closeted gay man in the 50s. It's a black woman, and I think the fact that it is a black woman is important. Like, it is both of those things. Because the Zelda, who's the black woman friend, she often talks about not really being heard from her husband, and the dynamics of being both black and a black woman specifically. So there's all of these marginalized people that are silenced in communities that, both literally for the main character and figuratively for the other two, and often literally, that they're the ones telling the story, and it's the two marginalized people that are translating for the main character. They are providing the voices, not male people in power, and it's very just so wonderful
as well. Because by doing that as well, you make it that it's a ensemble piece, as much as our lead she's very definitely her romance, but by having those other characters in there and them helping her and being her voice in their other ways, but also their stories being very prominent as well to the the whole thing, and very clearly making a white straight man the villain of the piece. There's a lot. It's talking about community, and it's talking about inclusive support, and we could talk about it a lot. It's a great movie.
If you want to know more, I wrote a whole essay about it over on my Substack.
You should absolutely go.
About I called it The Shape of Genre.
But we are talking about genre, and that's why we want to talk about this, because I think we have moved away in many ways from single genre media. I don't think you could point at, so other than maybe a legacy piece, or like maybe franchised stuff, maybe like the superhero Marvel movies, I don't think you could necessarily, but even them, there's sci-fi and there's so much mixed in with them because of the nature of superheroes. I don't think you could point at something and say it's a single genre thing anymore. It's going to be at least a little bit mashed in with something else. And I don't know if that says something about the taste of the zeitgeist at the moment, what people are interested in. Because I think that even romance novels, contemporary romance, I would say, is always popular. But romance as a genre has always crossed over with historical, with fantasy. Obviously, we've talked about romantasy being very popular at the moment. And sci-fi romance is becoming bigger within that as well. And then, of course, supernatural romance, Twilight, and all that kind of stuff. There's so much in there, and I think it's very difficult. The only one I can think of off the top of my head is maybe Heartstopper being contemporary romance, but then again, this idea of there's queer literature
I was about to say,
as a genre.
If you're putting LGBT as its own category,
and the only reason I would say that is because personally I don't think it should be, but it's because of what is on shelves and how things are categorized by booksellers. So we're going by that for now, I think, so again, like when I say about like talking about pointing at one genre being its own thing, that is down to how things are kind of categorized within publishing, roughly speaking. Again, it's an ever-changing field, and I don't know everything about it. I'm not a publisher.
Well, especially because some kind of genres that we think of as being like, say for example Dresden, which is a mashup of urban fantasy and detective. It originally was a noir specific kind of detective, and then it kind of just became general detective-iness. But basically, the idea of urban fantasy being its own genre that can be smashed together is also rather weird and new, because urban fantasy
is
itself,
already its own smashed genre.
It was a smashed genre. It was a contemporary mixed with fantasy, and now that's become such a recognizable own genre. It's like I think romantasy is coming that way. I've seen people referencing it's a romantasy / this, which it's like, well, but romantasy is already a mixed genre.
Yeah, and the same with rom-com, right? You see people talk about rom-com / sci-fi, or whatever, like or rom-com contemporary. Like they are put now. Rom-com is very much its own genre because it's very recognizable. It's got there are certain tropes to rom-com that aren't part of romance.
Yeah,
you know, all that kind of stuff. So the reason I would say that romance is probably the one that I can point at mostly. The other one I would say is probably mysteries and like contemporary mystery, as being like, that's the genre. Detective fiction, okay, detective and crime fiction are two different things. They're separate, and then so that's why, like, I would say it's very difficult to point to this is this genre anymore, because even if you say romance, contemporary romance is still it's a subgenre of romance, historical, all these sorts of things. Like, you know, they all have slightly different tropes to them because they are historical romance. Bodice rippers, sort of your Mills and Boon kind of stuff is one part of that, but you know, your Outlanders, those sorts of things. But then you also have historical romances that are much more historical, you know, they're much more leaning into the history genre rather than the romance genre. So they aren't one thing. And the same as detective fiction, right? So contemporary detective fiction, is that detective fiction that is contemporary to now or contemporary to when it was written? So Agatha Christie is contemporary to the 1940s and 50s. 30s, does it go back that far back? Pre-war?
I think so.
Okay, yeah. So it's contemporary to when she was writing.
Maybe not, no, because it depends on which one, because I think the very first Poirot was mid-war, because Poirot is a refugee.
But to a greater extent, they're contemporary to her writing time, whereas Sherlock Holmes is not. Conan Doyle was not writing in the 1880s and 1890s. He was writing at the turn of the century. This is why, well, what does it mean? You know, it's like, it's almost why it's completely irrelevant to put certain genres in there. But then we do, because humans, we like categorizing things. But I really like seeing how many are now mashed together, because I think for a long time that didn't happen. Like, the urban fantasy thing's very new.
Yeah.
And talk about, like, my favorite topic for a moment. Like, Terry Pratchett books for a long time were just considered funny fantasy books. They're fantasy books, but they're kind of funny. And actually, then they're not even that. They're fantasy books that are political, and some of them are detective books, and some of them are satire, and some of them, you know, they're not. Discworld isn't just fantasy books that are funny. They're much more than that. And I think that's a very difficult thing to categorize. And just why these genre mashups we're seeing have happened, because people suddenly go, oh, hang on, we need to let people know this is similar to that kind of book, but it's not that, you know, there's too many layers.
Well, I think it's also a difference between how we recognize the certain genre. Like, there's not a setting that you can point to and go, that's a detective setting. There are kind of classics, but those are specific to the certain subcategories, right? Like, a mansion in the middle of England with a really rich family is Agatha Christie. But that's not going to be Sam Spade. You know what I mean? No. Like, you have your separate kind of ideas of what they fit into, but the structure of the story is what we recognize as being a mystery. So you can put that into a separate setting. You know, you can put that in with werewolves and fairies, and suddenly it's like, okay, I recognize this structure and I recognize the setting as two separate things to mash together.
Some genres are recognizable by their character tropes, like you said, so the detective doing all that kind of stuff, and some are recognizable by their setting or aesthetic, I guess, because, like, fantasy, I think, tends to come down to the setting more than necessarily the character tropes, and science fiction as well, like sci-fi, tends to come down to, is it on a spaceship? That's not just, but you know what I mean, like, there's a level of, like, if something's set on a spaceship, you probably know it's science fiction. Whereas if something's set in a manor house, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a murder mystery. I think that's an interesting one. But then again, you have lots of science fiction that's not set on a spaceship.
Yeah, I was about to say, so I recently read A Psalm of the Wild Build, which I highly recommend to literally anybody that I will allow to listen to me, because I absolutely fell in love with this book. But it's really short. It's only about 150 pages, but it was described to me as a sci-fi book. Reading it, I was like, I get it. I get why someone would put this as sci-fi, and the writer Becky Chambers is a very famous sci-fi writer.
Oh, right, yeah.
So
I see why that would have happened.
Yes, I see the connections, and I see why it would be categorized as sci-fi. The idea is that in this world, robots suddenly gained consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Then people, it's a very idealized world where people were like, oh, we shouldn't then keep making you work, which would totally not happen. And
again, let me point you towards the Murderbot Diaries.
Look at slavery. But what you would do is they allowed the robots to just go into the wilderness, and so the robots are just in the wilderness, and it's now at a time where people don't really know if the robots are even still around, and the robots don't know if people are still around. It's like it's
kind of almost dystopian, isn't it? Like
it is. It's kind of a weird sci-fi dystopian, but it's not, because like there are societies and they've all like moved on, and the main character is a monk, and it's like it's a really beautiful story. I highly recommend it. It's about a monk who gives tea to people based off of their mood. Sorry, they are also depressed. So it's
that's amazing. That sounds amazing.
It's a beautiful story.
And this is why it's so hard to categorize things, right? Like I said, you can probably guess that something set on a spaceship is science fiction, but how would you tell what that is?
Yeah.
You know?
If it hadn't been pitched to me as sci-fi, I wouldn't have put it as sci-fi. I would have put it as like a literary fiction, which is a whole nother conversation about what the fuck that means.
Can genre be literary fiction? And the answer is yes. Stop being assholes about it.
But yeah, it's
doesn't just have to be contemporary. I will fight you.
But yeah, it's like a lit fic kind of philosophical discussion about life, because that's what the book actually is. But because it's written by a sci-fi author, it's sci-fi. Yeah. And it is sci-fi in a way. It's like a different world. It's got robots.
I mean, this is why I really like the term speculative fiction, because I feel like that's speculative fiction, right? You're speculating about something. And speculative fiction is a very broad genre. Like,
it feels like people didn't want to have other as a genre, so they named it speculative fiction.
I know. I never know what people really classify as spec. I don't think swords and sorcery books count as spec fic.
Well, so somebody that I met wrote urban fantasy, and they said that they always pitch it as spec fic, which feels weird to me, but...
Was it like I've seen some people classify it as being like, is it something where there is our world and another world that is spec fic, or it's like it's sort of close to it? And I'm like, I don't necessarily think that's true either. It's a very, but then you have things like, so I've always quite liked the term weird fiction for these sorts of things as well, because, and I think people kind of classify weird fiction as a very specific thing now, but whereas when it started being written, it was again just...
It was the other.
It was the other. It was like having thoughts. It was being weird. And the same is true like pulp fiction and stuff. Like what's pulp fiction literally comes out of the term for being in a magazine that would be pulped. Like, you know, that's where it comes from. Like, it's not really anything to do with what's in it, but now it feels like it is, because it's like sort of your John Carter of Mars, Tarzan, these very kind of almost tropey, cliched sort of stories, because they were being written in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and they were trying things out. You know, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what they were. And this is why I think genre is such a difficult thing to define. It was always something I really struggled with at university when we were talking about genre, was, well, what's this thing as opposed to that thing? You know, why is, particularly things like, I think horror, sci-fi and fantasy are so difficult to be like, and you can tell me there's tropes to them, but I've read plenty of fantasy that doesn't have elves and fairies in it. You know, I've read plenty of things that would count as science fiction, like you were saying, don't happen in space, or don't happen in a scientific future.
And often I think the primary definitional separation between fantasy and sci-fi is simply whether or not someone has labeled it as science or whether they've labeled it as magic, and that's kind of the only difference. What are Vulcans if not space elves? Yeah. You know, and I mean, Star Wars is science fantasy, if there is anything, you know. It's space opera, and then you get all these subgenres and all this sort of stuff. And particularly, like, horror is a really difficult one, because like, It's defined by emotion, which is
yeah, exactly, like ghost
particularly
stories,
strange.
folk horror, you know, all of these kinds of things, they're so different from, say, the Saw franchise, or, you know, any Hostel or any of these horrible slasher movies, Scream, but and yet you lump things like Midsummer and the VV Witch, and, you know, that kind of thing in with Freddy Krueger. They're not the same thing. It just happens to be that people die. I find it very odd that these things kind of get put into the same big category of horror when they're not. And yeah, there'll be things that kind of, I guess horror is, do people die horribly and everybody has a horrible time with it? Yeah, okay. Is a slasher movie the same as Hellraiser? No, not really. I see the crossover points of the horrible murder, but like, horror doesn't even have to have horrible murder in it to be horror.
I think as much as we are seeing a lot of the crossover stuff, and it seems to be quite a lot of what exists, I do think sometimes people think it's a lot more simple than it is.
Yes.
Because I have definitely read crossover that wasn't really. And I mean, it was in the sense that both things were there.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes you have to kind of ask yourself, like, well, why am I combining these two things? And this is, again, why Shape of Water, I think, is a really good demonstration, is because the use of romance in particular to monster movie in particular helps to shine a light on humanizing the other.
Yes.
Because you are literally romancing and romanticizing an other. That is what is happening. So there is a reason why those two genres are chosen in order to tell that story.
And I think Del Toro particularly is a master of this.
Well,
Pan's Labyrinth is astonishing, because Pan's Labyrinth is essentially a war movie and a fantasy movie at the same time, and a children's fantasy movie and a horror at the same time. Like, it's pulling on like your Alice in Wonderland threads, and it's got what is a very dark war movie happening at the same time as an actual horror movie, and like they're all interwoven together to show the understanding of what is happening in reality. He's very, very good at it, and he understands the use of genre.
Yes.
You don't just mash genres together for the hell of it. You shouldn't. Like, they should complement each other in some way, and I think that's something that sometimes we don't necessarily understand. Romantasy kind of makes sense because people want to maybe have a fun time with sexy elves. We know this. The fan fiction of Lord of the Rings has told us this. But sometimes if it's just doing a romance in a fantasy setting, what is the point? Is the romance any better for being in a fantasy setting? Or is it just a romance story that you've slapped an aesthetic on top of? Is that truly a crossover of genres? Or is it exactly the same as any other romance book, but with elves and they've got wings and maybe there's a dragon? You know, yeah. I don't know. But then people like that, so who am I to criticize? People like it, they like it.
Yeah, there was I don't remember the book, so I'm not even gonna try to beat around what author it was for politeness sake, because I don't recall. But I read a book, I think last year or something, where it was a cross-genre thing, and it was one of those where it felt more like somebody was kind of just being like, well, a mystery is just the fact that you don't know what's going on and there's a detective, right? And there's a lot more nuance to detective fiction, and particularly mysteries. And like I said, there's a structure to it. Like, one of the things that I found when I was writing my novel, for example, is my first version of it was structured like a fantasy novel. And when I read it, it wasn't bad. It wasn't a bad book, but something was off with it. And then when I completely rewrote it, structuring it like a mystery, suddenly everything worked. And it's that thing of, it's like, but if you don't recognize that there is a plot structure that is inherent to a mystery, that is essentially a four-act structure, then you're not going to recognize how to actually utilize this.
No, exactly. And this is the thing, is you can actually write, this is why I say that crime and detective and probably mystery are kind of separate, because you can write a detective story without that structure, because it's not necessarily, this is the difference between reading Sherlock Holmes and reading Poirot, right? So Poirot, you can figure it out if you want to Sherlock Holmes, you're never going to. He's always going to be
No.
one step ahead of you.
But the idea of
Conan Doyle
figuring it out
making
actually was
Yeah.
an Agatha Christie thing that didn't really exist.
No, exactly. And that's it. And that's why you kind of have this thing of like, if you want to write a Sherlock Holmes style story, you're not going to structure it the same way as you're going to structure an Agatha Christie style mystery. So this is the thing of understanding your genre and why it's worth noting that crime and detective and mystery tend to be separate, because a mystery doesn't even need to have a detective involved. It just has to have the structure of a mystery. There are several Agatha Christie books that follow the same structure. That don't have a standard detective character, a police officer or a private detective or anything as the main character. That Nine Little Soldiers doesn't.
Well, so this is probably a separate discussion, but I see that particular story. It's now called And Then There Were None.
Ah, okay.
Because the original of Nine Little Soldiers, it was not soldiers, it was a slur. So we call it And Then There Were None, and the line has soldiers. Okay. Which is actually kind of weird because her use of, it was particularly for Black people, it was as a reference of something.
I knew that it had a different title originally.
Yeah, it was something to demonstrate others, but obviously when she was writing it, that wasn't really a big time slur. Well, it was a slur, but it wasn't recognized as a slur in quite the same way as it is now. So I get why it's rewritten, but also it kind of stripped some of the discussions of othering that happened. But anyway, the point is that that story is often, because it is written by Agatha Christie, and there are other ones in her repertoire that fit into this, is often still described as a mystery. It is not a mystery, it's a thriller.
Well, there we go.
It's not a mystery, it's a thriller. And there are many other ones that fit into this. Often her Tommy and Tuppence series are also thrillers. They're spy thrillers. They are not mysteries. Yeah. But because they're written by Agatha Christie, people lump them together with the mysteries. And I actually was watching a thing about studying mystery things, and they kept using And Then There Were None as their example, and it made me absolutely bonkers because I'm like, it's not a mystery. It's not structured like her classic mystery. It doesn't have any of the elements. You can't solve it. She purposely made it so you can't solve it. It's not meant to be solved. It's meant to be a thriller. Yeah. That's the whole point of it.
And this is, again, why it comes down to the idea of genre being... whatever you're in, like you were saying about Becky Chambers, that got put under sci-fi because Becky Chambers is a sci-fi writer, or at least that's what she's classified as. You have this problem of like, are you classifying by the writer or are you classifying by the book itself? And particularly when you have somebody who's got a bit of a name behind them, you're going to kind of play off that, and be like, well, Becky Chambers is a sci-fi writer and people know her for that, so this will put it in sci-fi because then it'll sell to her fans and all that kind of stuff. We're not going to try and market it differently, particularly, even if that's not what it is. And I think that's a very difficult thing. I can imagine for writers who have been put in that position, that must be very frustrating when you're like, but I want to write something else. I can totally see why people might use different names for different works so that you don't necessarily have that happen. Yeah. And then you have some people who are just like, I'm going to write The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy over and over and over again in different ways. Douglas Adams, what a wonderful person you are. No, he did write other things. But it does feel like that sometimes. It is a very interesting discussion of like needing to understand, because like I don't know if you've seen it at the moment, but a lot of books are being advertised with their tropes, like the little arrows. Yeah. Which I don't like because I kind of feel like that's spoilers.
It feels very romantasy.
It does, definitely. The romance books definitely do it, but then you see other books doing it, and I'm like, no, you're a thriller. I don't want to know what your tropes are. Yeah, like no, shush. Firstly, I don't really like books being advertised by tropes anyway. I think that's a very TikTok thing, because it's like, I think it will have tropes in it, because of course it will. Yeah. That's writing. That's writing, that's storytelling. But I think it feels very much like tick boxy to be like, friends to lovers kind of stuff. And I'm like, are you tagging on AO3? So it kind of has that element to it, which annoys me on just a personal level. It's not necessarily a criticism of how to advertise a book, but it frustrates me. But then also I think there is a kind of element of, sometimes they're advertised with having a trope they don't actually have. I'm sorry, but if they're rivals and then they end up being lovers, that's not enemies to lovers, guys. That's not what that is. That's rivals to lovers, and that's an entirely different thing. That's a classic rom-com like trope. Rivals to lovers. That happens all the time. Mm-hmm. It's not enemies to lovers. Enemies to lovers is a very, very specific... They want to have to kill each other. They literally need to be wanting to kill each other for that to be the case. Just because they're on rival hockey teams does not mean they're enemies to lovers. All right? It's not. I'm very passionate about this.
I could tell.
It just annoys me. And there are so many like this where they'll say it's this trope. where it's actually like, no, it's just that's the buzzword trope, and you think you can get away with it, and it definitely feels like it's coming out of the Bookstagram, TikTok, book talk kind of space of like people wanting a quick way to advertise stuff to grab the attention and not necessarily need to like go into the nuance of things. Also, I was told the other day by somebody who is a big reader that they've been coming across more and more that younger, I guess she kind of said Gen Z, Gen Z people, but that kind of young, but the younger end of it, don't like reading books that are third person anymore because they want to feel like the main character, and if they don't relate to the main character, they don't like it. And I'm like, are we okay? Like, are we like, I mean, obviously this is just anecdotal from one person and her experience, but like that just shocked me that like surely the whole point of reading is to learn about other people. You don't need to relate to every character you come across. That's
it must be a certain way of, because I also don't relate to a lot of the way that people talk about reading sometimes because I have aphantasia, which we've talked about quite a lot. But I don't imagine anything. To me, it's my own voice in my head as I am reading. I don't even have different voices. I don't have anything. It is literally just I am reading a book.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's almost like if I was reading someone's essay. Kind of like of what happened to them if it's in first person, which I kind of do still like, because Shard Lake is written in first person.
Yeah.
And it definitely felt like that. Like it felt like I was reading someone's journals as I was doing research, you know, especially because of it being a different time as well. Like,
I mean, because I have dyslexia, if I haven't said that before. I have dyslexia, and so for me as a writer, when I'm spending lots of time using my energy on writing, I tend to actually listen to audiobooks as my way of reading, because it gets tiring for me otherwise having to kind of do both.
Yeah.
And so I don't care. Someone else is already telling me the story. I already have another person telling me the story. I have a narrator doing it for me. I'm already getting somebody else's point of view, whether it's first person or third person. It's somebody telling me the story. So I don't really understand that as a thing. And maybe that's just because of my way of engaging with reading or engaging with books because of that. But it doesn't make that much difference to me whether it's first person or third person, because it's already not me.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, and see, that's another one where making choices is important. Like, when somebody makes something first person or makes something third person, and as I'm reading it, I'm going, this would have been better the other way. And it's not because I want to be in the head and relate and all that kind of shit. It's just that sometimes the story makes more sense. Like, I wouldn't be able to imagine Shard Lake in third person. It wouldn't work.
No, because you need to know what's going on.
You need to know what he's thinking. You have to know the way he's navigating the world. Like, those are all things that are really important to the plot. And to being able to understand the themes of the story and all of those things that are happening. So you need to have it in first person. It doesn't work otherwise. And likewise, if you're not getting any of that kind of stuff from the narration, then there's no point in it being in first person.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm quite a big fan of third person closed perspective, because you essentially, it kind of gives you a little bit of best of both worlds. It's a bit of a cheat. I love it. It's fun. But it means that if you want to have a moment of going into the character's head, it doesn't go into I. You can just be like, he thought. And it doesn't feel weird because you're already in closed perspective with them. You're not necessarily an omnipotent, I can say words, floating form watching everything happening. You're already only following this person. You're essentially playing a video game at that point, right? You're behind the player character, following them around. So you only get their thing, whereas like open third person perspective is that thing of essentially the camera going through different you're just there observing the whole world.
It plays into genre. I find that horror works best when it's either very closed third person or first person, because it's that intimate connection of you feel like you're as trapped essentially as the main character is. Where if it was kind of a broader omniscient thing, you wouldn't feel as scared. So like you do need to play into the genres. There's a reason why certain genres have certain tropes of narration as well.
Yeah, and even notably if you move away from books, horror particularly, you tend to find you're very closed on a certain character. You'll have obviously all movies and stuff have, and TV shows have a lead character, But with horror particularly, you'll find it's very tight onto a certain character or group of characters, and you don't leave them. You don't go anywhere else. If you do, it's to give you a very specific piece of information. But it's why, like, Scream particularly works really well, because you have this very, very closed group of characters who you are getting every moment with. And it's why things like Blair Witch Project, which is obviously a first-person horror movie, to a greater or lesser extent, because you're in shaky cam and it's found footage, that works really well, because you don't get anything other than their perspective in that moment, and that's all there is. And that's why that works really well. Not always.
Babadook was like that too, where it was only the mom and her kid, and almost every scene, I think with there was a couple of exceptions, but most of them were also in the house. So it's the claustrophobia of both who you are exposed to and where you are.
It's why the first Saw movie is honestly, as somebody who really enjoys the way that horror works, I don't really watch horror movies because they scare the bejesus out of me and I don't like them. And everyone who knows this about me thinks it's very funny that I have like this weird obsession with horror as a genre, but never really actually watch it. I'll just watch video essays, like, yes, tell me about it, thank you. I'm that person who used to read the back of the DVDs and be like, oh yeah, I'll go on Wikipedia and read the rest of the plot. You know, like I don't actually want to watch people die.
Okay, sorry. I just have to note that sentence that you just said is, I think, unique to a very small demographic of ages, which is that you are around when there is DVDs to read the back of, but can access the Wikipedia article.
Yeah. It's so specific.
It is very specific. Sorry.
Yeah. But so the first Saw movie is literally in one room. You don't leave the room. You're in a room with two men dealing with the problem, right? And the problem is horrible. That's it. That's quite. I mean, I think maybe you go to a police officer at points, but essentially the premise is two people locked in a room together, and that's the movie. And that's really difficult. And I think, again, like, this is why when people say that they don't like reading things in third person or first person, I'm like, it really depends on the thing. I am never going to read a romance book in first person. That would make me feel so uncomfortable. Absolutely not. I don't want that. I mean, I'm not a big romance person in general, but if I'm reading romance on A03, I want it to be in third person. I don't want to be involved. I just want to be like, they're having a nice time.
That seems cool for them.
Yeah, good for them. I want to be like, hey guys, did you date? Brilliant, excellent. Tell me the details. You know, like
not that detail.
Not that. No, too much detail. Too much. Back up. But you know what I mean? Like, I don't necessarily want to be the person being romanced. I just want to enjoy the tropes and the journey. You know, I love a rom-com. And it's just following the tropes and the journey of watching people become a couple. It's kind of lovely. You know, it's sort of like, oh, isn't that nice? You know, particularly I love a Christmas rom-com. Holiday, amazing. But it's definitely one of those things where I think it really depends on your personality. And so for like the problem with like TikTok and stuff like that is I think it's kind of encouraging certain things to be popular, which always happens, but it's just massively widespread now, and it's kind of there's an idea of what reading is and what a genre should be and all that kind of stuff, and it's a bit like, and I'm generalizing because of course that's not true of everybody on BookTok or Bookstagram or BookTube or whatever, but it does seem to be kind of becoming a bit more prolific in the sort of tropes and genres that they should be this and all this sort of stuff. And I hope that this doesn't start becoming a problem with when people subvert these tropes. You know, I don't know. I just thought it was a very interesting comment to say that there were people who were like, I don't relate to this character, so I'm not going to read this book.
Well, but I mean, that's something that we've been seeing for a long time. I mean, that was the whole thing in our discussion on representation in video games, is that was people rejecting certain games because they couldn't relate to the main character, which is something that many people have had to deal with for a very long time.
Yeah, exactly. And I do wonder whether, particularly with there being more choice, that there is a thing of, well, I want to read books about people like me, which I think is completely valid. Absolutely, you want to read books about people like you, but you should also read books about people who are not like you. I don't mean straight white men. Nah, fuck them. They've had it for too long. But like, you know, go and read books that have, I say this as somebody who's currently reading the Shardlake books. Technically, Matthew Shardlake is a straight white man, but he's also a disabled man in Tudor England. And his best mate is a, how to describe guy? he's described as Moorish in the book.
Yeah, well, he's from...
Granada.
Yeah, I was about to say, I can't remember, because he was from a very particular... His family was from a particular Africa, because it was obviously during a time where Africa was spreading quite a bit through empire.
He's not white, essentially.
Yes, and they describe him as having very dark skin, and somebody in the first book said that they thought he was made of wood when they first met him, because obviously they don't have much exposure to people of color.
It's just interesting because obviously within the book they're using historical language to describe him, so it's quite interesting. But anyway, so like, yes, your protagonist is technically a straight white man, but he's a disabled man in a period of time where being disabled is not only life-threatening to a certain point, but also massively ostracized, more so than you really realize until you start interacting with it. And that's quite... He's also come from a working class background and kind of all of this kind of thing. There's a lot about Matthew that isn't necessarily a specific thing. And so this is what I mean, is that you should read books about people who aren't. You'll be surprised. And sometimes people are like, oh no, this is a straight white guy writing a straight white guy book. And then you can just stop reading, and that's fine. We've had enough.
I do like when people demonstrate, though, that there are shortcomings to the straight white man.
Yeah, absolutely.
When written by that. So Jim Butcher does this quite a lot with Dresden, where one of the critiques I've seen of the Dresden Files is that they think Jim Butcher is a misogynist because Dresden is a misogynist, and it's written in first person, and I'm like, no, those are two different people.
Yeah.
One of them is a writer and the other one is a fictional character. But one of the ways that I can tell that it's the character, not the author, is that the character's misogyny is used as a fatal flaw for the character. He often he fails to see women as being capable of doing things, which is often to his detriment. He doesn't ask them for help when he should have, or they are the culprits when he didn't see that as being possible. And Shardlake had this as well.
Shardlake has it. It's a big flaw for him.
Exactly.
Flaw,
is that he thinks, oh, well, women can't be capable of this thing because it's Tudor England, and this is our view of women. Well, I mean, I could already tell that from, he did piece it together eventually, but... Yeah. But it's one of those things where you see the difficulty in that, of like, when you see that as actually a flaw, then you go, okay, this is somebody recognizing this as an issue within either themselves and the people around them, or just in society in general. But most often I think they tend to be very aware that it is probably also their own shortcoming as well.
And I think that again is why it's important to read books from different perspectives, because you will suddenly realize that someone who you may have had a certain biases about, they're aware of their own faults, and they've written them in, and they've explored them through fiction, or they may be giving you a completely different perspective on your faults as somebody. You suddenly go, oh, hang on, no, I think I actually do that, or I didn't realize I did that, but I'm seeing it reflected here. There's a reason why my favorite Toe Pratchett book is The Truth. And it's because the main character I relate to very heavily, like warts and all. I'm like, oh no, oh dear, and it helped me kind of think about some stuff to do with myself. That's just one book, so it's only going to be one little amount of thought about it. But at the same time, like when you do come across those things, having both sides of it, someone you relate to heavily, but also in their flaws, and having somebody you don't relate to at all, but they reflect back onto you, maybe ways that you treat other people, or maybe ways that you don't think about certain things, is really important. You have to have everything. And that's why when people are like, I only read this kind of book, I only read this genre of this kind of protagonist, I'm like, oh, that's boring. I mean, sure, do you, but like, don't want to read anything else, maybe, at all,
Well, we've gone off track a little bit.
Yeah, sorry. We just talked about books now.
But maybe, do you want to sum up maybe just like 2 to 3 suggestions for people?
Oh.
I mean, we've already talked quite a lot about, I think, the ones that I would. Shape of Water, I would definitely suggest if you haven't seen it. It is, I don't know if it's quite cross-genre. You can tell me in discussions on Discord if you agree or not. But A Psalm of the Wild Built, I will just suggest because it is amazing. And I'm going to lend it to Holly because I will force everybody I know to read this book.
Yeah. I think, I mean, we've talked about Shardlake a lot. And I'm really glad you're reading them too, because I want to talk about them at length. But Unfortunately, I don't have the actual books because I have them on audiobook, but otherwise I'd lend them to you. I do think everyone should read them. I do think they're great. They absolutely, when a book like you're like, oh yeah, this deserves the hype.
Yeah.
Like, oh yeah, this one deserves the hype. Well done. And I'm not going to suggest Pratchett because I do that all the time anyway. Like, that would be boring of me. I am going to suggest pretty much anything written by Andrew Joseph White. One of his books is about to be made into a film by the Wachowski sisters, which is exciting. Or maybe one of them. Not clear on that. But they are, I would say they're horror, and they're supernatural horror kind of things, leaning into, but they have, one of them is historical, and one of them is more fantasy based, but they also are very, they're conversations about the trans experience told through sort of supernatural lenses, which is why I would kind of class them in that cross-genre space. I will say, trigger warning to both of the books, you read the foreword first to make sure you're in the right headspace to deal with what they talk about, because they are quite intense reads, as anything talking about the trans experience while also being a horror is going to be. I've only read one of them all the way through because I had to take a moment. Actually, I would say, if you haven't read Mickey 17, the film has obviously come out recently. Mickey 17 is the film, the book is Mickey 7, which are a kind of hard sci-fi, but again, they hit that comedy element. They're sort of comedy sci-fi books. But they also kind of cross over again with sort of a pseudo-historical kind of thing. The main character, Mickey, is a historian. And so you end up getting told essentially a sci-fi book from the point of view of a historian who is severely depressed and very tongue-in-cheek about everything. So again, it's the narrator who makes it funny. I loved Mickey 7. It's so good. It's so fun. But it is definitely a sci-fi book, but again, in that space of like, is it completely a sci-fi book when you're being told it like it's a history book? It's sort of, again, like the Lord of the Rings. It's a bit tricky on that front. This is why it's difficult to be like, this one's definitely cross-genre. Yeah, is it? I really enjoyed Mickey 7. It's great. And if you enjoyed the film, you'll definitely enjoy the book.
I mean, like I said, I already suggested Stuart Turton. I would suggest again. I loved them. And a load of these things will be in the description.
Sorry, I was just looking at my bookshelf to see if there was anything that would jump out at me, but there's a guitar in front of it, so it's a bit tricky. But yeah, and if you guys have any suggestions, obviously, like, comment on our Discord, or there will be social media posts soon. There will, I promise. They will be up by the time this comes out.
Hopefully by the time this comes out.
So yeah, comment on our social media posts about your thoughts as well. And join our Patreon. If you're not already on our Patreon and you've got to this point, you're several episodes in now, and you're listening to the ending where we're suggesting things to you, sign up to the Patreon. It's £1. It's great. You get lots of cool things. And we really appreciate everybody who's there. So once again, thank you to Moira for our new logo. Isn't it exciting? And we will be back soon.
All right. Well, thank you guys for spending time with us, and we'll talk to you next time.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Remember to like, review, and subscribe wherever you are listening to this podcast, and do give it a share. Tell your friends, family, fellow fans. Get the word out however you feel like you can. You can follow us on social media. Links are in the show notes, as well as some links to further reading for anyone who might be interested. Music for this episode was Nowhere Land by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0. This episode was produced by Vivian Asimos and Holly Swinyard.